This month, a special edition of 219 West, the aftermath of Sandy. Hello and welcome to 219 West. I'm Bridget Sayage.
And I'm Laura Shin. More than 2 weeks after Sandy hit the New York region, people are still coping with the devastation.
More than 190 people were killed by the storm. Millions were left without power and thousands were homeless.
Special voting procedures were put into effect by Governors Cuomo and Christie to make sure that the hundreds of thousands affected by the storm could vote.
Experts estimate that the storm will cost more than $50 billion. For those whose lives remain disrupted, the emotional cost is staggering.
Snapshots of Van Brunt Street during Hurricane Sandy displayed scenes of devastation. Water, several feet high, rose from the waterfront and surged along the storefronts, old factory spaces, and residences.
I'm down here 81 years, all my life. I never seen anything like this. The water in these apartments went this high. Refrigerators were picked up from the water and thrown.
Red Hook was one of Brooklyn's neighborhoods hit the hardest by Hurricane Sandy. An old waterfront industrial community, the past few years has seen a burgeoning recovery of the Brooklyn Peninsula, and a major center for new businesses has been on Van Brunt Street. But those, like the 52,000 square foot supermarket Fairway, were ravaged by the storm. And 2 weeks after Sandy, many still without heat and power were left to pick up the pieces.
We were about 7 weeks into building out the restaurant, and Hurricane Sandy came, wiped us out. We had about 6 feet worth of water throughout our whole facility here. Cleaned out most of the equipment we had bought and some of the supplies we had to build.
Billy Durney was preparing to open Hometown, a barbecue restaurant on Van Brunt Street. But after the storm, he joined the huge outpouring of local activists, volunteers, and business owners mobilizing relief efforts among themselves to help the community.
Within the next morning I came here, and other than obviously the tourists taking photos of everything that's happened, every single business owner, we didn't even wait for assistance from the communities. We just took it upon ourselves to go out and help our neighbors.
Local groups like the Red Hook Initiative stepped in before official channels to bring together residents and business owners to help each other out.
We had some friends at Red Hook Initiative and Calvary Church, and we'd said if they would give us the food, then we'd be happy to smoke it. So for the last 6 days, we've been cooking around the clock, smoking. We had 1,000 pounds of meat donated to us, 500 pounds by Fairway, and 500 pounds from a friend of ours who is the general manager at Toby's Public House in South Park Slope. So it's a broad community-based outreach here. Today we're cooking briskets and pork loins, and all this food's going to go out to the communities abroad who don't have power and electric, and we're happy to do our little part. It's the Brooklyn way. This is what we do.
Volunteers have been collecting supplies and donating time and money to help those in need in Red Hook. Hundreds met on the pier on a Sunday afternoon to rush out and help the cleanup. Some even did so with a spring in their step.
Trying to make everybody happy, trying to make people laugh and sing along with us, put a smile on their face. Trying to help out the neighborhood. Like, we find it that it's sad that certain people is out here and they're about to shut down project buildings because it's not safe for them no more. So we find it sad that they don't have a home.
The recovery of Red Hook will take time as city agencies continue the effort to bring power and heat back to the area. But while they wait, locals like Durney can afford to remain patient because he knows the neighborhood has his back.
Red Hook's like Mayberry. I mean, it's just a really amazing local community of artists and restaurateurs and people who really just care about, small town community, and that's what we're about. So we're out here cooking, and we will be until the power's back on, the electric's back on, and feeding those in need.
This is Kate Traficante for 219 West.
Hurricane Sandy was a wake-up call.
That's a wind gust right there.
Whoa!
There's a reality that has existed for a long time that we have been blind to, and that is climate change, extreme weather, call it what you will, and our vulnerability to it.
For the people of New York, this felt like a turning point.
People like to live in low-lying areas, particularly by the ocean, and we believe that we can protect ourselves from these kinds of storms, probably in some unrealistic ways.
In the hardest hit areas of the city, residents have been forced to realize that preparing for a storm is more than buying flashlights and bottled water. For them, this means a change in their entire view of where and how they live.
I don't know, I think it's just the atmosphere, the pollution and just the time changing. Yeah, that's what I really think. And just for us having this hurricane, I think the next one is going to be even more devastating, and people need to take it more seriously.
You know, they talk about these times in the Bible. You know, the North Pole warming up, it's so hot, you know, water rise and the sea level's gonna rise. These coming generations, they're gonna have, you know, problems.
Andrew Friedman is senior science writer at Climate Central, a climate change information website.
This was a freak weather event that was kind of supercharged in some senses by climate change.
As Sandy made its way up the coast, two major weather systems got in its path. One high-pressure area over Greenland stopped it from moving east, while another cold front in the Midwest pulled Sandy towards it. But that does not mean that climate change did not contribute to the catastrophe. Over time, the water temperature in the Atlantic has risen. Warm water fuels hurricanes like gasoline fuels a fire. The storm sucks up the extra water vapor and turns it into even more rain. The water levels around New York and New Jersey and worldwide have also risen in the last century. This increases the chance of flooding.
It gives hurricanes a higher launching pad to launch a surge from. It's sort of like if you just slowly raise the floor of a basketball court so that even the short players are able to dunk all of a sudden.
Storms come and go for a variety of reasons, but the inescapable lesson of Sandy is that when they do hit, their impact could be much worse than in the past. And as climate change continues, that will be true to an ever higher degree.
We've known for a very long time that this area is pretty vulnerable, and that with certain climate change related effects, that's only going to magnify the risk as we go forward.
In New York City, we can no longer pretend we are not in danger. Other storms will find their way here. When they do, will we be ready? For 219 West, this is Justin Mitchell.
I'm with two experts with very different views about what's been happening with the climate increasingly and what the proper response should be. Dr. William Selecki, director of the CUNY Institute for Sustainable Cities, and Dr. William Happer, professor of physics at Princeton University. With Sandy, it's become a wider accepted view that bigger and sometimes catastrophic storms are happening more frequently. How do you explain this? Dr. Selecki, I'll begin with you.
Well, I think it's important, specifically looking at an event like Sandy, to recognize that you can't attribute any one particular event to climate change. But I think that one of the things that we can increasingly start to look at is how the impacts of extreme events might become greater with conditions of climate change, particularly things, for example, sea level rise. Sea level rise has been taking place in the New York metro region. Part of that is a natural process. We can look back over the past century or so, about 1 inch per decade. But with a warming climate, there's a possibility that rate of sea level rise could increase, and that by the end of this century, you could have as much as about 4.5 inches of sea level rise per decade. And what that means is that if the same type of storm occurred, let's say 70, 80 years on, you're going to have that much greater impact because there'll be greater forward movement or inland movement of storm surge.
Dr. Happer, Dr. Selecki cited climate change. Do you agree that this is why this has happened?
No, I certainly don't agree, and I don't think that's what Professor Selecki implied. He was very careful to explain that one event doesn't prove anything. At my age, I've seen many hurricanes, and some quite a bit worse than this. So it may be true that it's widely accepted that Sandy was due to global warming, but actually many other things are widely accepted that aren't true. Many people widely accept astrology. It doesn't make it true. You need to look at the data, and the data don't show anything unusual about Sandy. I'm very much supportive of the idea that we should be more attentive to how we build our infrastructure to make it resistant to extreme climate. There's going to be extreme climate no matter what we do, and so the sooner we get started, the better.
Dr. Selecki, what do you see as kind of some ways to mitigate the effects of a storm such as Sandy?
Okay, well, I think it's important to, just in terms of terminology, just a minor thing, mitigate is oftentimes in the context of climate change about greenhouse gas reduction.
Okay.
But I think if the issue is particularly looking at Sandy and reducing our exposure and enhancing resilience, we want to think about the issues of adaptation. And that it's well recognized that we live, at the water's edge, and that this is a very, hazardous place to sort of have large and intense settlement. So there's a range of different things that other places and communities that deal with hurricanes and their variability, such as in Florida and other places along the U.S. coast. So there's opportunities for hard technological innovation. Building of physical barriers is the most obvious example. You could have more strategic technological applications to, let's say, provide caps for tunnels and so forth that might get flooded, or other kinds of things to reduce flooding at particular locations, or maybe a range of policy initiatives which might discourage further intense development on the coast, or encourage types of development that will be more resilient to storm surge.
And as you mentioned, the global sea level has risen by about 7 inches over the past century. And you mentioned a gate and caps, but is there something, would you consider that a short-term or more long-term goal to these infrastructure?
Well, I think the important thing to recognize is the idea that, urban areas are inherently adaptable. They are very much able to be rebuilt. I always look at cities as being unfinished in the sense of being continually rebuilt. And that if you look, for example, I always look back at time, and maybe in 1840 there was almost no buildings in the city of New York that had indoor plumbing. By 1880, most of them did, at least some even basic aspect connection to it. So we are capable of making and rebuilding our infrastructure. And maybe another good example, going back in time, in 1888 we had a huge blizzard that knocked down the power lines. And that was one of the catalyzing events to putting power lines underground in the city of New York. And so maybe we'll be looking at a similar sort of discussion following Sandy.
Dr. Happer, you're nodding your head, so.
Yes, I agree with everything that Professor Selecki said. And I think we can take some lessons from East Asia, too. The city of Hong Kong is exposed to hurricanes even more than New York. They get hurricanes like Sandy practically every year. And so nothing happens because they've adapted to it. They've been very careful to put utilities underground. They've limited building in areas which are exposed to storm surges. And I don't know, if they can do that, why can't we do that?
And as we know, conditions are very dire globally in so many areas. There's been talk, nationally about this fiscal cliff and reducing carbon footprint, which I think is something that Dr. Selecki, you are a proponent of, would definitely take a toll, I think, on the economy. And so how do you prioritize, and at what cost?
Well, I think the crucial issue is this question of what capacity does government have to respond. And this is sort of extending obviously beyond the issue of specifically looking at Sandy in New York. But there are certainly, any time that you have huge demands or huge sort of social challenges, what we've seen historically is there are ways of defining economic opportunities within them to sort of rebuild or to reinvest. And the most extreme example is an unfortunate example of war. But there are other examples where there have been opportunities to reinvest, and certainly the issue of infrastructure. The U.S. Infrastructure is aging, and there's a clear recognition that this needs to be upgraded. And I think what a lot of people advocate is how do we build the best infrastructure, the most energy efficient infrastructure, one which would beyond the fact of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also would make pure economic sense, but also as we rebuild to make sure that that infrastructure is resilient to any kind of climate or other sorts of impacts that might affect it.
Dr. Happer?
Again, I agree with that. I think that we can find the resources to improve infrastructure. For example, we've squandered, the last I looked, it was close to 100, I don't know the figures, but it was many, many billions on, solar companies that have gone bankrupt, all with taxpayers' money. If we'd spent that on infrastructure, we'd be way ahead.
And Dr. Happer, I think you would agree that your view scientifically is in the minority within the scientific community and popular opinion as well. But do you anticipate, like Galileo, that your view will prevail? Or conversely, do you think that with kind of more evidence leaning the other way, that you'd be open to changing your mind about this issue?
Well, I'm always open to changing my mind if I see facts. I actually look personally at the facts of climate and what it's doing. Most of my friends simply talk to each other at cocktail parties, and whatever is the opinion of the day is the opinion they have. But when I look at the facts, I don't see any support for alarmism. The climate is always changing. The current changes we're having are not unusual at all. We've had much worse in the past.
Dr.
The past changes, have had nothing to do with people burning fossil fuels.
Dr. Selecki?
Well, all I could say is I hope that Dr. Happer is right. But, I will say that, this is, I think, beyond the moment here to discuss, but I think we need to look, there are lots of different evidences that one can bring forward, and I think the issue certainly merits a lot of discussion because it is whether or not, and to the extent of which, human action is playing a role in climate seems to be, there are a number of, I would say, number of bits of scientific evidence that will illustrate that process. But all that being said, we know that humans are impacting, whether it's at a global scale or a local scale, the environment in which they live, and it's in that moment that there's a great challenge in terms of how to create a more sustainable community for all.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. You've been great.
I'm here with Bruce Stutz, a specialist in science, natural history, and the environment. Welcome, Bruce.
Nice to be here.
So in your most recent article, you talk about how building a huge surge barrier at the Verrazano Narrows would have saved us billions of dollars in damages. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's not just a surge barrier there. There would have to be a group of them. The scientists have recommended having storm barriers either in the opening to Jamaica Bay, at the Verrazano Narrows, maybe in Arthur Kill, and in the East River near the Whitestone Bridge. This group of storm barriers could be shut down during a hurricane event or a northeaster where the tides are rising, and then protect the city and its waterfront and its infrastructures from damage from tides.
And how realistic or even feasible is this for us to build?
Well, I think it's feasible in that there are examples of these all around. There are even examples. Rhode Island has one, and Providence, and there's a smaller one in Stamford, Connecticut. Very large ones in the Netherlands protecting Rotterdam. There's a one that was recently finished in St. Petersburg, Russia, which is very, very large and extensive. And these are series of gates that come down when the storm tide comes up, and large gates that will allow shipping to continue through these barriers while they're not being used. The question is that none of these can be built in a short period of time, and will take a lot of study, a lot of understanding of what their effects will be on shorelines that are outside of the barriers, as well as those inside the barriers.
So we're talking huge sheets of sort of what, iron, bronze, just coming down.
Just big gates made out of steel, whatever the materials are. But in a sense, these have been built and are planned in lots of areas around the world. They combined with, I think, the softer approaches of adding new wetlands, protecting the shorelines in many other ways, go along with this as well.
Right, you mentioned creating sort of artificial oyster reefs and...
There are lots of proposals out for softening the shoreline, which takes the energy out of the oncoming tides. The problem has been that these were decided that the city had decided to build in this resilience over a long period of time as sea level rose. The question is now is that these storms come, and when you have a storm of this magnitude, or even storms of normal magnitude, they are increased in the damage is increased because of the rise in sea level.
And you've cited in your article that we've seen these sort of accelerated symptoms of climate change. I mean, how are we dealing with that?
I think that what's accelerating is just the fact that because of sea level rise, the tides that would normally accompany a hurricane, even a normal hurricane or northeaster, have a greater effect on the shorelines of the city. So it's like having a bathtub that you step into, but if you add water to it and you step into it next time, it's going to overflow, and that's what's happening. Is that there's the sea level has risen, so that any storm you get now creates a larger hazard than it would have when sea level was lower.
Right, and we have science at hand now. We have government officials who have met with scientists and who have held forums and who've discussed and seen these computer models and have predicted and forecasted this happening.
Yeah, they've known about this for a long time, and the city has been fairly proactive, especially under the Bloomberg administration, in developing plans and actually beginning to undertake ways of giving the city what they call resiliency to climate change, because over the next 50 years, with sea level rising an inch every 10 years, the problems will only increase. So they've been aware of that. But the question is, when you have storms that come in that can cause $17 billion damage, as this one did just to the city alone, and the cost of creating a storm surge barrier system of them is estimated at $15 billion, suddenly the idea of creating a barrier becomes much more of a believable prospect.
And there is this sort of aspect of the incredible or the unbelievable in this whole climate change debate. So is that really what's stopping us from taking action?
I don't think at this point even the debate over climate change is as key to this. That will still go on. But the fact is that sea level is rising and is going to continue to rise. And that storm surge on top of the sea level rise is going to be a fact. And so all the rest of the arguments about sea level, about climate change can continue, and will, but the sea level rise is a fact, and that's not debatable.
And why is it so hard then for us to interiorize this idea, the notion that our planet is changing?
I think that it's not necessarily a matter of believing it, but it's a matter at this point of the fact is there and you have to face it. And so the question is how to face it. There's a great deal of cost involved, great deal of time in conceiving and building these kinds of structures. The structures in New England, in the province, took 20 years to build, and that was a small one. You've got a lot to consider, but there is no. I think at this point people recognize that this is a effect of sea level rise, and it's going to have to be dealt with not only here but in major cities across the world, because suddenly coastal cities have aggregated tremendous assets, financial assets, population assets that have to be protected during these large storms.
Mm-hmm. Bruce Stutz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've seen how the storm has affected lives. We've heard about climate change and whether we'll be facing storms like Sandy more frequently. And we've heard about ideas about rebuilding. So how are we going to pay for all this? Joining me now is Greg David, Director of the Business Reporting Program at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism and columnist for Crain's New York Business. Greg, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So a few days ago, President Obama visited New York and saw some of the devastation that Sandy caused himself. And a few days before that, Governor Cuomo asked the federal government for $30 billion for recovery. What are the prospects that we can get that money?
Well, $30 billion is a figure that's been thrown around about the amount of damage in New York. And if Governor Cuomo had asked to repair the damage from Sandy, it would be a slam dunk. But to continue the sports analogies, this is a Hail Mary. And why is it a Hail Mary? Well, because he's not just asking for money to repair, he's using the storm as a vehicle to get tens of billions of dollars to upgrade infrastructure. So he's trying to change the rules of the game without quite admitting that he's changing the rules of the game. His other big hurdle is the climate in Washington. I mean, all the headlines are about the fiscal cliff. Well, the fiscal cliff is about taxes and it's about spending. And Congress is going, if there is going to be a deal, Congress is going to have to cut spending. So is Congress going to give us billions for a smart electricity network while they're cutting other spending? We'll see.
Speaking of the damage, Cuomo cited $50 billion in damage. What does that figure include?
50 is for the whole storm. 30 billion of that is believed to be in New York. Now, it's pretty interesting. Chris Christie in New Jersey have not been willing to put a number on it because they say they want to be right rather than first. And that was one of the, there have been a few, but that was one of the Christie digs at Cuomo in the last couple weeks.
Okay. And going back to the fiscal cliff, what are the consequences that we're looking at if we go over the cliff?
Well, the conventional wisdom is that if we go over the cliff, which means that tax increases would kick in on January 1st because the law that cut taxes expires, and all these spending cuts we agreed to would also kick in on January 1st, that we would plunge back into a recession. I think it's mostly baloney myself. The impact will not be that immediate. And the issue really isn't about going over the fiscal cliff. The issue is about whether taxes are going to be raised on the wealthy and how much we are going to cut federal spending, and if we do cut it, where we're going to cut it. These issues are going to be very difficult to resolve by January 1st, but people are trying to use the deadline as a tool to get discussion and maybe a settlement reached.
And just going back to the election really quickly, it came down to two very different visions of the role of government. So, you know, with the re-election of Obama, what kind of governing model are we expecting to see in the next few weeks and months?
More important than the re-election of Obama was the fact that the Democrats not only didn't lose the Senate, but they gained seats in the Senate. The election settled a few things. It settled that Obamacare would go into effect and create a much larger government role in healthcare. 30 to 40 million people are going to get coverage, many of whom will receive large government subsidies. Yes, taxes are going up on the rich, we just don't know how. And Medicare is not going to be messed with, so we decided that. So we have decided for the near future a more expansive role for government in the economy is what the country wants, at least by the margin of the election, and that's where we're headed.
Okay, Greg David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of 219 West.
We'll be back next month with more stories from the 5 boroughs and beyond.